I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me try as best I can to respond to it. I think the only place where you might get a difference between what and how would be with respect to the moral argument. And that is to say, my argument is that moral values are grounded in God and they are therefore objective. And that's not inconsistent with saying how we discover moral values is through evolution and social conditioning and parental teaching. That would be to confuse the order of knowing with the order of being. And my argument has nothing to do with the order of knowing how we come to know these values. My argument is with the foundation of these values. What is the foundation in reality? So with respect to that argument, at least, I think that would explain perhaps a difference between us.
Dr. Steyer.
Well, I'm not sure that I disagree either, except I just don't see that it's a convincing case for the existence of God to just say we have good thoughts, therefore God must exist. It seems to me we need a lot more evidence than that, and that moral values can very well be human. In fact, I'm sure they are the result of our humanity.
Next question.
During this debate, there has been a lot repeated mention of the word existence, regarding God's existence. And this brings to my mind something that has bugged me some time, and is there are, let's put it this way, there are several names, for the divinity.
I'm sorry, I don't understand you.
There are several names for a divinity, like God, Jehovah, and so and so. What do these divinities have in common? This is something that has bugged me. A linking property that is reduced into a common factor. In my opinion, that was the fact that they are all representations or with different dressings of the notion of unit. And yeah, I'm coming to the question. So my question is now, how do we find out whether the concept of unit is eternal or not? This is far more important than the existence of God or not. Because if the existence of unit can be proved not to be eternal, existence of unit, the concept of unit, unit, one, yeah, the concept of unit is not eternal, then the concept of God is not eternal either.
Okay, Dr. Stenger, go ahead and answer the question.
Okay? Sorry for my heavy accent.
I was thinking, I'm glad that's your question. It's difficult to know what to say to a question like this, except I guess I would say that there's a principle in science and philosophy called Occam's razor, which says that you should not multiply causes beyond necessity, that you're only justified in positing such causes as are necessary to explain the effect. And so I would say in my arguments, to posit one creator and designer of the universe, one ground of moral value is sufficient, and it would be a violation of Occam's razor to postulate a plurality. And therefore, my arguments do affirm union or the unity of ultimate reality.
So the concept, I can just respond that,
please have a seat, sir.
because that's good. I'm glad you explained that. Because I think that assuming no unity, just assume that what we have is what we see with our eyes, the material universe, is the simpler hypothesis from the standpoint of Occam's razor. As long as we don't need to invoke anything beyond the natural world, then that's the more parsimonious assumption.
Next question.
All right, Dr. Craig. when you say that without objective moral values, things like child rape and incest would not actually be wrong, and then you go on to use that as evidence for why objective moral values do exist, how does this not fall into a fallacy of consequences, insofar as the truth of your premise lies in our
if I understand your question correctly, the fallacy called affirming the consequent is the fallacy that says P implies Q, Q, therefore P. And that's the fallacy of affirming the consequent. But my argument doesn't go like this. My argument follows the valid inference form. P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. And that's valid. The reason it might be confusing is because there are already negations in the original premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective values do exist. That is to say, it is not the case that objective values do not exist. Therefore, it is not the case that God does not exist. That's equal to saying God does exist. So the extra negatives in there might make it a little confusing, but it is a valid argument based on that inference form. P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. It doesn't affirm the consequent.
Well, again, sure, the logic is there. It's indisputable. It's the premises that are disputable. And the idea that you can't have objective moral values without God is the one I dispute. There's no reason whatsoever why we can't have objective moral values without God.
Next question.
Dr. Stinger, I had a question for you. Earlier on in your arguments and then just now during these questions, you mentioned that you see no biblical record outside of the Gospels of the empty tomb. And I seem to find just one such record in the book of Acts, chapter 13, where the Apostle Paul in Antioch, in a synagogue of Jews, defends the empty tomb without a rebuttal. Did you consider that possibility at all?
I did. Could you read me the quotation that you heard?
Yes, I can. So I'll break into his speech here, but in verse 28 of chapter 13 it says, Paul speaking to the Jews, and though they found no guilt in him, Jesus, worthy of death, they asked Pilate to have him executed. And when they had carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. But 3 days later God raised him from the dead. And for many days he appeared to those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. And this was Paul speaking.
Right, right. He doesn't say anything about the empty tomb. It says that Jesus was resurrected. So the empty tomb is not
After he was laid in the tomb, he
was resurrected. But the argument is over whether there is some observation of the tomb being empty that people referred to, and there was some kind of witnesses, in other words, to the empty tomb. All he says is it was resurrected. That could have been a totally abstract God that was resurrected, as far as that's concerned. There's nothing factual involved.
I'm assuming I can't speak further, right?
You asked your question.
I think the question is absolutely correct, that you also have references to the empty tomb in the sermons that are preserved in the book of Acts. Another one that you didn't mention is in Acts chapter 2, where Peter contrasts Jesus' tomb with David's tomb, King David. And he says, David's tomb is with us to this day, but this Jesus God raised up. And clearly the opposition of the comparison there is between Jesus' tomb and David's tomb. And the one is empty, the other is not. So you're quite right in seeing sources for the empty tomb in these sermons in the Acts. And what's significant about this is that many scholars think that what Luke preserves in Acts is not his own creation, but rather primitive oral tradition of the earliest preaching of the apostles. So that this goes right back to the earliest sources, the earliest eyewitness sources with respect to Jesus. So this is extremely early and important evidence that we have preserved in the book of Acts.
Next question.
Dr. Craig, you've argued that time began with the start of the universe, that the universe and time began together. You've also argued that the universe has to have a cause. I've always been puzzled by this. I think that the cause and effect are a function of time. And if you do not have time, you do not need a cause, that the effect is sufficient. The argument of cause and effect does not make sense to me in a timeless state. So I ask you to explain that.
I've addressed this question recently on my website, reasonablefaith.org. Every week I take a different question from readers. And about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I took the question about whether or not causation requires the existence of time. And I don't see any good reason to think that causation does require the existence of time. Think of it this way, cause and effect can surely be simultaneous. Think of a heavy chandelier hanging from a chain from the ceiling. Clearly, it is the ceiling that is supporting the chandelier. It's not the chandelier that is pushing up the ceiling. The causal arrow there goes from the chandelier as the effect to the ceiling and the chain as the cause. And yet these are simultaneous, at least on the macroscopic level. So it seems to me that God's creating the universe could be simultaneous with the origin of the universe. Indeed, what could be more natural than that? The moment at which God creates the universe is the moment at which it begins. So I see the act of creation and the coming into being of the universe as both taking place simultaneously at the first moment of time. So I would say that beyond the Big Bang, God existing alone is timeless, but that with his causal act of creating the universe, time comes into existence and he exists at that moment of time too. He becomes temporal. So that would be my view, and I've never seen any reason to think that that's logically incoherent or impossible.
Dr. Steiner?
Well, time is a human invention. Dr. Craig is assuming there's something in reality called time. Time measure on the clock. And it appears in physics, models that we build to describe observations. So that whole discussion, that whole description that he's talking about there is gibberish because it's based on an undefined concept of time.
Dr. Steiner, please move your microphone down on your shirt so it won't scratch and make popping sounds, please.
I think you said your mic is rubbing against your beard and it's making some interference. Move it down.
Next question.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
I guess first of all, I just feel privileged to have heard this debate. Thanks to everyone. And Dr. Singer, I hope that she'll hear my question in the sense that much of your speeches were that is this possible, as you were asking a lot of times. So I ask actually in reference to your last statement in your speech. Is it possible that our original and continual evil actions and choices have caused a general state of evil, and God's part in causing evil was merely to allow us the choice?
Well, I can't tell you what God's intentions are, but he sure made it a miserable world. And I don't know how you can reconcile this miserable world and all the suffering that exists with the God that's supposed to be good. I think an evil God is perfectly possible. And in fact, that's the only God that I think is reasonable in light of the world as it exists.
Well, I wish Dr. Steiner had brought this up earlier in the debate instead of in his closing statement, because it certainly is, I think, the most important argument out there for atheism, all the suffering and pain in the world. It used to be widely believed by philosophers, at least atheistic philosophers, that the existence of God and the evil in the world were logically incompatible with each other, that no possible world contained God and evil. This view now has been pretty much given up among philosophers because it lays a burden of proof on the atheist that is simply too heavy for him to sustain. He would have to show that it is logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. And that's just pure speculation. No one